Just TV.
Focused on quality and convenience, there isn't much you won't find at Marie's Mini Mart. Home-style breads, sandwiches, plus a variety of artisan breads and delicious single-serve desserts available exclusively at our Frecker Drive location. Marie's Mini Mart, with 25 locations wherever you go, there we are.
Hello, I'm Karl Wells. My guest today is a lawyer, an author, a former commentator, talk show radio host, and before that, he was one of the province's foremost politicians. He's having quite a life, and that's why we're devoting 2 episodes to this man. This is part 1. It's my pleasure to welcome Bill Rowe to the program. Welcome, Bill.
Great to be here, Karl. Finally I got here.
Yes.
Missed your cooking show because I was afraid when I was boiling the water I was going to burn it, so I never went on.
That happens sometimes. First question. Your father, your late father, Senator Fred Rowe, very well-educated man who began his life as a teacher, teaching around the province.
Yeah.
And you were actually born in Grand Bank. Do you have any memories at all of Grand Bank?
I think I was 2 or 3 years old when we moved out of Grand Bank. My 2 older brothers have memories of it, and of course Wesleyville, where they were born. And then he moved to St. John's to take over the principalship of Curtis Academy, which was then the biggest school in Newfoundland. And
That's right.
So that was a big, big deal, and I moved to St. John's. So I grew up in St. John's. I'm a Bayman by temperament, but I grew up as a corner boy.
You're like me. I was born in Buckens, but grew up in St. John's.
Right.
Now tell me about your formative years then, from, say, kindergarten up to high school.
Yeah. Well, I didn't have much memory of Grand Bank, but what I did have a memory of, and a tremendous memory of, was Woody Point, Bombay. Because my father, in his meanderings around Wesleyville, Grand Bank, and not Buckens, Bishop's Falls, he taught school in Woody Point, Bombay. I met my mother there, fell in love, and married her on Christmas Day. Of a particular year. And so every single summer, as my father was gaining his education, every single summer we went over from my earliest memories till I was 15 years old, and then rebelled as an adolescent. We spent in Woody Point, Bombay, which was really blissful.
What about your school years?
School years were spent at Curtis Academy. My father was principal there, but he gave it up after a few years. So he wasn't principal when I was there.
Byron March?
Byron March was principal. My parents sent me to Curtis Academy, even though they were urged by everybody to send us to Prince of Wales. Because not only did we have segregation on the basis of religion, that insidious force we had for years and years and years, but we also had an elite school and a poor people's school. And he made sure that I went.
So the elite school would have been Holloway.
Would have been Holloway and
Prince of
Of Wales, that conjunction. But and Curtis Academy from kindergarten to grade 11 went all the way up, so I followed that all the way up. But I also spent a formative year in Toronto, where my father, when he gave up his principalship, he went to Toronto to complete his education at U of T, and I went to a school in Toronto, and I don't know.
That must have been different.
I was a Newfoundlander.
Yeah.
in Toronto.
Yeah.
And
Toronto.
Toronto, they call it. We all called it Toronto. But Silverthorn School, so I don't know if there's much silver, but the Thorn, it wasn't poorly named when I came to the Thorn. And my teacher there was a Miss Frost, and she wasn't wrong named either. But I remember going to that school, and it was the most obnoxious place that I've ever been to in my life. I was very shy, naturally, as a 6-year-old, as most 6-year-olds are, but I was particularly shy. And she asked me questions, and I nodded. And she said, "Speak up, don't nod like a little Eskimo," Newfoundlander, right, in Toronto. So I developed some issues there in Toronto about that. I wouldn't say I got prejudiced against Toronto because I consider Toronto one of the world's great cities in many respects. But the attitude of Central Canadians concerning BC, Alberta, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia for that matter, is very hard for us to take.
How much of an influence were your mom and dad on you?
Pretty good influence. Well, the Bombay years were a great influence on me. My father was here at summer school teaching or studying, but they were very easy-going. I mean, there was no sort of discipline or anything. You wandered around, did what you want, probably a little bit too much. But it was, those formative years were very easygoing. And my father was a writer by nature and a teacher. He got into politics. He never should have got into politics, in my mind. I used to tell him that. He should have been a teacher and a writer because that's where his heart was. So I learned all that from him. And my mother, she was very skeptical and very cynical when it came to politicians. Joey Smallwood, for example. Here was my father, a colleague of Joey's after 1950, and my mother would roll her eyes every time his name came up. And I learned from that that you shouldn't be idolizing people who are in power and so on. I remember she was the only person. I remember Joey was reputed never to take a drink. And around Christmas time, before he went down south for a couple of weeks, he would have a couple of drinks of sherry and a couple of glasses of wine and a couple of glasses of liqueurs and so on. And one time he went off, you could only call him drunk. And he went off to go on NTV. And when he got in front of the camera to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, geez, he was so powerful in his abilities that he was able to cover that up.
Pulled himself right out of it.
Pull himself right out of it and act as if he was cold sober, except for one person. I only heard one person, maybe another person. My mother was sitting down there watching the news. Don Jameson was on doing his news cavalcade, if I remember correctly, and Joey came on to wish everyone a Merry Christmas. And my mother looked at him and she said, "My God, Joey's as drunk as the Lord." She had an uncanny ability to size up people. And I hope I inherited that from her because I think it added to my books, both nonfiction and fiction.
Now, you attended MUN in the late 50s, early 60s, I guess.
Yeah.
What was it like at MUN then?
MUN, I was there from 58 to 62. MUN could only be described, I mean, it's a great university now to my mind, but it could only be described in those days as one of the most elite universities in the world. Not because there was people there with money who could pay a $50,000 tuition, say to Harvard or something, not because of that, but because it attracted all the most brilliant people in Newfoundland. One good thing about Joey and others, my father for that matter in government as well, was that there was a tremendous scholarship program. Just about everybody at MUN, 1,000 or 1,200 or so of us in those days, plus 150 good teachers, George Story, Bill Kerwin, guys who wrote the Dictionary of Newfoundland. I mean, these fellows were first-rate people. Scholars, Dr. Seary, Dr. Stoker, these guys were well known throughout the world for their teaching abilities and so on. But all the people who were there, people I met there, were all attracted from everywhere in Newfoundland because of their ability and scholarship winners and so on. So you had people there like Clyde Wells. You had people there like Gwynne Dyer, Leo Barry, and on and on and on. Roger Simmons, I believe, was there at the time. People who later in life made a tremendous contribution. I've named 3 or 4 of them. There were many of them who were there. And you couldn't help but pick up a lot from people. Pat O'Flaherty. I mean, Pat was a great friend of mine. Just before he died, I gave a eulogy of Patrick when he died. I broke my heart, but he was a good friend, older, a mentor. He was there. Peter Neary was there. George Ivany. These guys, I mean, these fellows left Newfoundland, became presidents of universities. In George Ivany's case, was Peter Neary, one of Canada's great historians. Patrick O'Flaherty, well, anyone who knows Patrick O'Flaherty knows what he was like. Tremendous, tremendous teacher and historian. So that's what Memorial University was. I was a bit too young when I went. I was only 15 or so, when I went. So I lost a year or 2 through total immaturity, but then picked up on it. But it was a tremendous experience, and people who you dealt with later in life, in all areas, law, medicine, politics, ordinary people who came out and led the good life. You met them all there, right? There was,
I noticed that you were president of the Mon Liberal Club when you were there. Now, you would have, from the time you were age 10, I guess, your father would have been involved in elected politics. So you would have had more than a casual interest in politics.
Yeah, I guess Dad got involved in about 1950, 51. So yes, I was 8 or 9 or pushing 10 years of age. And from then on, I was, of course, greatly interested in politics. In fact, Dad used to take me around to his district and so on. And he recognized my interest in politics. So it's no accident that I became part of the Liberal Party of Memorial University and so on.
Now, around the time you were at Mon, John F. Kennedy would have been elected. Your generation and my generation had a tremendous admiration for JFK. Were you affected by that?
Yes, I was. And JFK had an influence on all of us. He was youngish. We were young. He was different. Even if you were a Protestant, you were struck by the fact that a Catholic, for the first time in history, was elected president of the United States through his charisma and his abilities and so on. Lots of stuff has come out about JFK since, not all of it, saint-like, but when it came to politics and policy and things like that, he really influenced all of us. And I remember I was at law school when he was assassinated, and it was devastating to all of us that this young man, this young liberal, small L liberal, with progressive ideas and so on, had been killed by some lunatic. And so we were all devastated. And I remember someone in the law school, a rather cynical guy, saying, well, it was an occupational hazard when he was assassinated. And we all turned on him,
Yeah.
I mean, it might have been an occupational hazard, but it didn't have to happen. And so, no, we were devastated by it.
Yeah. Speaking of law school, you were someone who came out of Memorial with an interest in literature, history, politics, and you go for your LLB on the mainland. Like, what was going through your head then? Were you thinking about taking a run at politics? Is that why you...
Yes, that was always in your head. And the problem, as you no doubt found as well, is that if you have a great interest in everything, if you're fairly intelligent and have a curiosity about everything, it's very difficult to decide what you're going to do once you get out of your education. And I think what clued it for me, I think it was my father who said it, but maybe somebody else did. Somebody said to me, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to write. I'd like to write all my life." And he said, "Okay, you want to write. Well, let me tell you that the first obligation of a writer is pay the damn rent."
Right.
You got to make money, and you're not going to make money writing. If you're Margaret Atwood, you'll make money, or on Detchy or somebody, you're going to make money writing. But an ordinary writer starting off, you're going to starve to death. And no one ever profited, to my mind, in writing by starving in a garret. No, it's just not right. So it's better to get yourself on your own 2 feet, a sense of independence, make some money, pay the darn rent, or the mortgage, as the case may be, and then work in your writing as time goes on. So that's what I decided to do. And I was also interested in law, no doubt about that. Tremendous sense of social justice for some reason or other that I had. Probably got it from my mother as well as my father, but this sense of fair play and justice. And so I was delighted to go into law, although I was easily sidetracked from it as time went on.
Probably had something to do with your age.
Yeah.
So then you went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. Your memories of your Oxford years are quite vivid. Why is it that Oxford and England made such an impression on you?
Well, Oxford University was a great spot. Not necessarily for the academic side of things. I'd already spent time at a law school, and I was doing law at Oxford, so I was kind of already ginned up a little bit on the law. So I could spend time talking to people, meeting people, getting renting a car or buying an old clunker and driving around Europe and so on, which is what we did. I mean, Neil Murray was over there. Neil Murray and I and a couple of other friends drove around. But people from all aspects of life, writers and British people, Commonwealth people, I mean, a tremendous experience. So everything that I did there kind of I took in. And if you have a writer's mind, you don't need to be taking notes all the time, although that's helpful. Things that are interesting stay with you forever. I mean, I can remember now as clear as when it happened, certain experiences that I had over there, right? Going around Europe or at the university itself. Now, the other thing there is that I made some good friends there, but particularly friends. There was one guy who was called a Cape Coloured. He was from South Africa. He was a person who was prejudiced against because of the color of his skin. This was in the days of segregation and so on. And so he and I became good friends, and he told me all kinds of horrendous stories about what it was like. And he had it good because he was a Cape Coloured. He was from the Indian subcontinent. If you were black, I mean, you were a slave. There's no other word for it. Anyway, that was great. Neil Murray was there. Neil Murray became over there. He was a friend here, but he came over there, became my best friend for a number of years. Died way too soon.
Oh, very young, yeah.
In his 40s.
Yeah.
And but he and I used to spend every second night we'd be together, right? Getting care packages from home and so on, or drinking a bottle of execrable Spanish Burgundy or something you wouldn't give a dog. Right? But you know, we were there. So it was really, and Neil Murray was one of the most brilliant people I ever met, bar none, including top guys at Oxford University. He was really on the ball and knowledgeable, and doing literature, so that was right up my alley too. So you know, things stuck with me there because they were of interest, and I find that that's what happens.
Then you came home and you made a run of politics.
Yeah.
Did Joey Smallwood, in fact, ask you to run?
He did. Joey Smallwood was 65 years old, and that was the old 80 in 65, when you were 65 back then.
Yeah.
We're talking about 1965, 66.
Yeah.
So Joey figured people were saying he's too old to be running again. Nowadays, you're almost too young to be running when you're 65. But anyway, he decided to get around them, all these young Turks, whether it was Ed Roberts, Clyde Wells, myself, John Nolan, Bill Callahan, all these youngish people, young and youngish people, John Crosby, Ali Hickman, you know, people who were younger, who probably wouldn't have gotten into wouldn't have been enticed into politics if Joey had been younger, because I think he saw the handwriting on the wall. I think he saw young people kind of eyeing him askance and probably thinking about taking him on in some way. Anyway, so Joey got all of us to run, and myself included. So yes, Joey enticed us to run, and I got elected on Joey's coattails.
Now, a lot of people were in his thrall, but from what you've told me, I don't think you were so much.
I wasn't in his thrall. I was already sort of, you might say, I wouldn't say prejudiced against him, but I had a healthy skepticism about him from my mother, not so much from my father, because he was his colleague, right? But, and also, young people talking, even someone like Ed Roberts, who was his executive assistant at the time, and John Nolan, who was well known in the media, right? And people, and Bill Callahan, who was a journalist, right? I mean, we'd have very frank conversations about Joey Smallwood. Or if you talk to Ali Hickman, I articled with Ali Hickman as it happened, so I had long chats with him. You picked up a healthy irreverence concerning Joey Smallwood.
What was he like as a human being?
He was an interesting character in that if you were with him by yourself having a chat, he was very subdued and soft-spoken. The minute he had an audience, somebody, then he turned into sort of a haranguer. I mean, he didn't hesitate. I think, didn't you tell me one time that you had an experience where Joey was on the phone to one of his colleagues?
Well, yes, I remember overhearing a conversation that Smallwood was having with one of my colleagues, and I was pretty impressed by his vocabulary of four-letter expletives.
He was.
Did you ever witness that?
Oh, all the time. I mean, 3 or 4
I
of
hope
us.
the barrage wasn't directed at you, Bill.
No, it wasn't. Joey had sort of a you might say, respect for some of the young people involved. He didn't have a lot of respect for some of the old colleagues from the old days, but like Ed Roberts, he had a respect for Ed Roberts and his brain, but every month or two, he'd take on Ed and berate him, and Ed would look crestfallen, and Joey would say, the thing about Ed Roberts is that he's so smart that he has a tendency to take over. He said, so you got to give him a kick in the backside every month or so. bring them down to ground level. And but Ed Roberts was the only one I knew who he did that to. He didn't do it to me. He didn't do it to any of the others I mentioned. I don't recall him ever doing it in cabinet or elsewhere to Clyde Wells or John Crosby or anyone like that. He would when they became his enemies, but not while they were his colleagues.
Well, Bill, we're going to conclude this episode of our interview and pick it up next time and talk more with you about your life, but also about Bill's latest book. And this is it. It's called The Reincarnation of Winston Churchill. So until next time.
If you want convenience, Marie's Mini Mart is here for you. A one-stop shop